Welcome to a special edition of EIR Talks on the Al Gore Danger. It's Wednesday, March 3rd, 1999. My name is Tony Papert, and with us in the studio is EIR Counterintelligence Director Jeff Steinberg. We're going to be drawing heavily on a presentation that Jeff gave on this subject, the Al Gore Danger, February 13th of this year at a Washington area conference. Now, Al Gore has grown in prominence from day to day to day, especially over the current weeks and months. He's virtually acting president. He's out front. He appears to be making all the significant policy decisions. And many people have the illusion, the dangerous illusion, that he has locked in the Democratic presidential nomination for the year 2000. At the same time, it's widely felt, and there's evidence widely available in the public domain, that Al Gore is actually unelectable. What is the story, Jeff? Can Al Gore be elected president?
Number one, Al Gore cannot and will not be elected president. And the effort is now underway on the part of the people behind Al Gore and, ironically, the people behind the George Bush Jr. campaign for the Republican nomination to create the illusion, to create the bluff that Al Gore is the only person who could conceivably get the Democratic Party nomination for the year 2000. This is aimed at deterring any other far more potentially viable candidates from among many people in the Democratic Party from coming forward at this point. There's the blackmail that Al Gore has, quote, all of the money locked up, and similar kinds of things to create a kind of groundswell. From the standpoint of the backers of George Bush Jr., it's understandable why they want Al Gore to have the Democratic nomination, precisely because he couldn't win an election. A recent Pew Charitable Trust poll of independent and Democratic and Republican voters reveals that 45% of those people agree on one and only one thing, which is that they will vote for anybody, Democrat or Republican, over Al Gore. Now, this is not something merely in the realm of speculation, because once before, Al Gore ran for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party on his own. He was not running as the mannequin-like coattail of a qualified and very personable candidate like Bill Clinton, but was running for the Democratic nomination. That was in 1988. And at the beginning of my presentation several weeks ago, I gave a kind of an encapsulated history of Al Gore's 1988 campaign, and it just illustrates his unelectability. So let's look at the first part of that presentation. Good. Many of you may not remember it, but in 1988, U.S. Senator Albert Gore Jr. ran for the Democratic Party presidential nomination. Gore was as desperately, obsessively committed to being President of the United States in 1988 as he is today. You can see the look of determination in his eyes in this 1996 campaign photograph that was taken by his wife Tipper and published in a family photo album called Picture This. It's available at the Loudoun County Public Library, therefore I assume it's available in most every public library in the United States in a town with a population over 200 or so people. Now, appropriately, Senator Gore's 1988 national campaign headquarters was located at the Opryland Hotel, the mecca of the country western music world. Gore's campaign strategy was to score a big win on Super Tuesday, the mega primary day that grouped together most of the states of the Deep South. Gore dubbed his campaign strategy the Confederate strategy. It failed. Although Gore took some of the southern states, he was badly beaten by a little-known New England liberal, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, in Florida and Texas. And African-American voters throughout the South cast their votes overwhelmingly for Reverend Jesse Jackson. If Al Gore's performance was poor in the heart of the Confederacy, his record north of the Mason-Dixon line was absolutely abysmal. In the make-it-or-break-it primary election in New York, Gore was shunned by Governor Mario Cuomo, and he won a kiss-of-death endorsement from New York City Mayor Ed Koch. On primary day, Dukakis won 51% of the Democratic votes. Jesse Jackson won 37% of the Democratic votes, and Al Gore came in with barely 10%. Thus ended Al Gore's 1988 quest for the presidency. By the tail end of the New York primary campaign, Gore was in such a state of bipolar rage over his dismal performance that he resorted to desperate, outright racist cheap shot attacks against his opponents. You can take the boy out of the Confederacy, but you can't so easily take the Confederacy out of the boy. First, his one big New York political booster, Ed Koch, badly damaged Gore's chances by declaring that Jews would have to be, quote, crazy to vote for Jesse Jackson. A disastrous blunder that Gore promptly compounded by publicly endorsing Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir's vehement rejection of Ronald Reagan's call for a land for peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. So Gore was on record as early as 1988 as being absolutely opposed to the policies towards the Middle East peace process being pursued by President Clinton. Gore's campaign publicist in New York, not coincidentally, David Garth, had been Shamir's campaign manager and was also the longtime political advisor to Ariel Sharon, the butcher of the Palestinian refugee camps at Sabra and Shatila. And the head of Gore's New York campaign organization was Brooklyn Assemblyman Noah Deer, who was a founder of Rabbi Meir Kahani's Jewish Defense League terrorist gang, who never abandoned that racist cause. Gore next one-upped Koch in the closing moments of the New York campaign by launching into a tirade against Dukakis for letting killers free on weekend furloughs from Massachusetts state prisons so they could rape and murder. Yes, it was Al Gore, not George Bush, who launched the infamous Willie Horton campaign. A Bush campaign staffer, Floyd Brown, watching the Gore-Dukakis-Jackson debate on television, merely followed up the lead provided by Gore. The same Floyd Brown, by the way, would emerge in 1992 among the most vicious slanderers of President Bill Clinton.
What was Gore's response to this stinging rejection by the voters?
Well, you know, very often when people go through traumatic political failures, they'll step back, they'll reconsider, they'll almost sort of review their entire career or their entire life and search for something that gives them an answer to why they failed. In Gore's case, why he failed to capture the hearts and minds of the core constituents, the traditional voters of the Democratic Party. I'm reminded of Franklin Roosevelt, who was struck by polio after having launched a successful political career in New York State. And he used that long battle with his disease to go back and reread the Founding Fathers. When he recuperated from his illness, he reemerged as a very much transformed political figure. No longer the New York, Wall Street patrician speaking to the interests of the British-American crowd, but a figure who was committed to reviving the best traditions of our republic. In Gore's case, he went the other direction. Gore simply made it more and more clear in everything that he did following that hideous defeat in 1988 that he was going to be, like Adolf Hitler before him, the candidate for the financial oligarchy, who would do the murderous things that would be required of a person literally holding dictatorial power over the United States government during the period of the most immense financial and monetary crisis that civilization has faced in the modern era. So again, let's return to my presentation of a few weeks ago to see what Al Gore did after his 1988 crushing defeat.
Good.
Now, Al Gore's 1988 failed run for the presidency taught him a bitter lesson. The traditional constituents of the Democratic Party, minorities, labor, senior citizens, and America's technology-oriented Mittelstand, universally rejected the senator from Tennessee. It was a stinging defeat, But Al Gore and his inner circle of political handlers knew what to do next. In the tradition of another unelectable tyrant of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler, Al Gore delivered a public manifesto offering himself as a fully conscious, willing servant to the most genocidal faction within the British, American, Canadian financial oligarchy, the faction associated with the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, his son Prince Charles, and their Dutch ally Prince Bernhard. The same extended Anglo-Dutch BAC oligarchy, with its Morgan and Brown Brothers harem and allies on Wall Street, had bankrolled Hitler's Nazi Party in 1933. If the healthy, forgotten majority of American voters were not prepared to back him, Al Gore was prepared to carry the water for the heirs of Montague Norman, J.P. Morgan, and Hjalmar Schacht. Just witness Al Gore's recent public tantrum against the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir bin Mohamad, who dared to cross paths with the Queen's own very special speculator, George Soros. Witness the impeachable offenses committed by Al Gore to salvage LTCM, David E. Shaw, and other hedge funds caught by surprise in last August's Russian freeze on commercial bank debt payments. Actions that Al Gore took behind the back of President Clinton at the moment that President Clinton was in the middle of his grand jury trial testimony facing the impeachment that lied ahead. Gore's Faustian manifesto, his own Mein Kampf, was published in 1992 under the title Earth in the Balance. Some of his more insightful critics promptly dubbed the book Mein Planet. Now, don't get me wrong. The publication of Earth in the Balance marked no political Damascus Road for Al Gore. As the lifetime protege of one of the most evil figures of the 20th century, Armand Hammer, Al Gore had already established his credentials as one of the more corrupt and shallow figures in American political life. His father, Albert Gore Sr., had sold his soul to Anglo-Soviet trust agent Hammer in the 1940s, and even earlier had been sponsored into politics by Bernard Baruch, a Confederate transplant to Wall Street who would join forces with Lord Bertrand Russell at the close of World War II in an effort to create a world government possessing a monopoly on the nuclear bomb. Gore Sr., after losing his U.S. Senate seat in 1970, assumed the presidency of the Council for a Livable World, which was founded by the original Dr. Strangelove, H.G. Wells's protege Leo Szilard. This was the legacy that Al Gore had long since inherited from his father. As the head of the Congressional Clearinghouse on the Future and Globe, an international parliamentary group peddling various world federalist schemes, Al Gore Jr. had already manifested a tree hugger's love for every obscene New Age cure-all for the so-called ecological crisis. And Al Gore and Newt Gingrich had long ago forged a partnership as the third-wave Tofflerite Bobbsey twins on Capitol Hill. Two leading BAC oligarchical figures who we've interviewed in recent weeks have intimately linked Al Gore with the British monarchy, specifically with Prince Philip. Maurice Strong of Canada and Martin Palmer, the senior religious advisor to Prince Philip, both confirmed to us that the personal correspondence back and forth between Al Gore and Prince Philip dated back at least to the mid-1980s. And in May of 1990, the two of them had a lengthy face-to-face meeting in Washington, D.C., as Al Gore was working on his manuscript, and as the head of the official British oligarchy was staging a conference at the National Cathedral to revive paganism. At the time of the meeting, Prince Philip, the international president of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, had recently published his own genocidal tract, Down to Earth, And the impact on Gore's book is evident from a simple comparison of the two texts, especially on the issue of the need to kill off as many dark-skinned human beings as possible in the shortest time frame. Perhaps the only distinction between the two books is that Prince Philip could quite openly flaunt the fact that he was an oligarch and talk openly about eradicating 80% of the world's population. Gore had to only be slightly more cautious in his language, as you'll hear in a few minutes.
What is this crowd behind Gore? What are they trying to accomplish?
Well, number one, in the recent period, Lyndon LaRouche has given a kind of a brand name to this particular faction of the international financial oligarchy. He's referred to it as the BAC, the British American Commonwealth Oligarchy, which is to say that you're looking at the concentration of power from the financial standpoint centered around the City of London and Wall Street. I'm not just talking about banks. I'm talking about strategic raw material cartels that are presently grabbing up every strategic raw material wealth of this planet. I'm talking about people like Prince Philip of the financial oligarchy that's committed to population reduction on an unprecedented genocidal scale. And these people see in Al Gore someone who genuinely believes in this outlook and is devastatingly committed through his own personal ambition and drive for power to being their instrumentality for accomplishing this, even if it means the elimination through assassination or other means, now that the impeachment process has failed, of Al Gore's so-called partner in power, Bill Clinton. Again, let's look at the presentation of a few weeks back.
Good.
Now, it's useful to focus on Earth in the balance because it defines the menace of an Al Gore presidency most efficiently within the larger context of the struggle between the nation-state system and the oligarchical dark age, which has been the theme of everything we've discussed so far today. We have reached a moment in history, the end of a 500-year epic, when the Republican nation-state system and the system of feudal oligarchism and usury can no longer coexist on this planet. Either we defeat the oligarchy in the near term, meaning in the immediate months ahead, or we plunge for several generations or more into a dark age of unprecedented horror. It's vital that everybody in this room comes away with a very clear understanding of why Al Gore must be immediately destroyed in the period just ahead of us, and why it's all of our responsibility to ensure that that is accomplished. As Lynn has powerfully demonstrated in a series of recent EIR studies, and as you'll be reading next week in the pages of The Road to Recovery, Al Gore is as unelectable as president today as he was in 1988. But no one can take too much comfort in that reality. For the moment, the British-directed assault on the Clinton presidency has been severely set back as the result of the February 12, 1999 historic U.S. Senate vote rejecting the 2 articles of impeachment. Al Gore is not yet occupying the Oval Office through BAC coup d'etat. And I think it's important to reflect on the fact that had the Senate vote yesterday gone with a 2/3 majority on either of the impeachment counts, Bill Clinton, under law, would have been obliged to leave the Senate chambers, and Al Gore would have stepped in and immediately been sworn in as president by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So we came extremely close to seeing this insurrection against our Constitution accomplish its objective. But for the moment, that did not happen. And we can take a substantial amount of credit for that most recent defeat of a long string of attempted British insurrections against our constitutional republic. Many of you were here in this very room during the Labor Day conference when we saw the signs of the deviant Democrats moving to pressure President Clinton to resign from office. We launched an initiative at that moment that was very much of a factor in ensuring that yesterday's vote on the Senate floor went as it did. It was not a foregone conclusion in September, and our efforts were unquestionably one decisive factor in ensuring that Bill Clinton is still president today. Do not rule out, and I repeat, as Lynn said this afternoon, do not rule out an assassination attempt against President Clinton, particularly as he moves to reassert his hold on the presidency. And most emphatically, if he joins what Lyndon LaRouche has described as the Survivors Club by taking up the urgent task of creating a new Bretton Woods monetary system and bringing the United States fully into the Eurasian land bridge project. And do not underestimate our power as a political movement. If we do our job here in the United States and around the world as the global financial and monetary crisis plays out in a rapid succession of shocks over the immediate weeks and months ahead, President Clinton will be recruited to the Survivors Club. We know the BAC oligarchy better than they know themselves. They rarely assassinate a prominent figure out of simple revenge. They assassinate when they feel that their immediate future interests may be jeopardized. Remember, the present BAC forces are the heirs of the assassins of Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. Major Lewis Mortimer Bloomfield, the British Special Operations Executive Officer who headed the Permindex Assassination Bureau that killed JFK and nearly murdered Charles de Gaulle, was the founder of the Canadian branch of Prince Philip's World Wildlife Fund, along with Al Gore's Maurice Strong. And he was a charter member of Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard's 1001 Club, the secret financial arm of global eco-fascism. So as long as Al Gore remains in office as vice president, and as long as he enjoys the public perception that he is Bill Clinton's preferred successor, the enemies of this country and of all of civilization will remain a heartbeat away from power in Washington. Now, as you'll read next week in The Road to Recovery, it is also our urgent responsibility to ensure that a viable candidate is nominated by the Democratic Party for the year 2000 presidential elections, if this nation and the world are to survive the onrush of this greatest global financial crash in modern history. It should be obvious that today the most qualified candidate for that nomination is Lyndon LaRouche Jr. Presumably there are others within the ranks of the Democratic Party who could emerge as viable candidates, provided that the primary process itself is open and precipitates a debate over how to restore the Democratic Party to the tradition of FDR. We saw during 1994 with Senator Kennedy's warning about the Democratic Party becoming a cheap imitation of the GOP of the Contract on America, some of these FDR reflexes. Through 1995 and into 1996 even, we saw with Senator Bingaman, Senator Kennedy, Senator Daschle, and others, response to the emerging global financial crisis, the collapse of real standards of living among American working families, other indications of this tendency. All of those efforts were crushed through the collaboration of Al Gore, Dick Morris, and others in the Democratic National Committee. So in a very real sense, the fight to destroy Al Gore in the immediate days and weeks ahead is the fight for the soul of the Democratic Party. Never mind the fact that the Bush machine is drooling over the prospect of Al Gore as the Democratic nominee in the year 2000. And I think anybody who had the opportunity to see George Bush Jr.'s pathetic, drooling interview on C-SPAN about a week and a half ago can understand why that's the case.
Gore has a published book out, Earth in the Balance. What does it say?
Well, rarely does a politician come forward with such a detailed, elaborated account of his philosophical outlook and, by implication, the policies that he'll pursue if placed in high office. In this case, Gore defines himself as the evil twin soulmate of Prince Philip, the head of the British oligarchy, who, in his own writings, has made it clear that, in one most famous instance, he said, "I'd like to be reincarnated as a deadly virus so I can make a contribution to the vast reduction of human population." This is the outlook of Gore. And again, I devoted a great deal of attention in that conference presentation to a kind of a textual review of his book, Earth in the Balance, because it really says it all about who Al Gore is as a person and what he will do if he's ever allowed to become, in fact, the head of state of the United States, as he's now de facto established himself. So again, I think let's look at this fairly extended segment, the concluding section of my presentation from a few weeks ago.
Good.
So let's go back now to the question of Earth in the Balance, and let's consider the fact that in his capacity as Vice President of the United States, Al Gore swore an oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And let's see whether the views that are expressed by Al Gore in his personal testament hold up to the standards of living up to our Constitution. Now, as I said, Al Gore's manifesto came out in 1992. And therefore, obviously, it became an instant issue in the presidential campaign once Bill Clinton was induced to name Gore as his vice presidential running mate. A DNC staffer, Jonathan Sallet, was assigned on behalf of the Clinton-Gore campaign to put together an opposition research memo on Gore's book, Earth in the Balance, in anticipation of a frontal assault against Gore's deep environmentalism during a scheduled vice presidential television debate with Dan Quayle. Quayle, not surprisingly, never raised the issue. And so the Clinton-Gore campaign memo serves as the only serious assault against Gore's green ideology during the 1992 campaign. Through channels unknown, Sallet's memo found its way onto the fax machine of the Republican minority whip Dick Armey, and from there it found its way into the pages of the Wall Street Journal. The Sallet memo read in part, and I'll quote from this for the next minute, quote, "Al is not qualified to be vice president. He has no principles. He admits he has voted for programs in which he does not believe. He's apparently guilt-ridden about the role of men in society, and perhaps as a result of his own weakness, believes America as a whole is psychologically dysfunctional. He's a bad scientist who doesn't care enough to get his facts straight. The fact is, we can't be certain that global warming or the level of CO2 or even the changes in the ozone layer pose a threat as burdensome as the cost of Al Gore's proposals. Al is a radical environmentalist who wants to change the very fabric of America. He criticizes America for being America, a place where people enjoy the benefits of an advanced standard of living. He has no sense of proportion. He equates the failure to recycle aluminum cans with the Holocaust, an equation that parodies the former and dishonors the latter. He is a Luddite who holds the naive view that technology is evil and wants to abolish automobiles. If Al Gore has his way, we would give up America's jobs and destroy the economy. Again, this was a memorandum prepared for the Clinton-Gore campaign in 1992. Not a bad compilation of soundbite snipes at Gore's kooky and dangerous views. In fact, it was probably the most insightful document produced by the DNC during the entire 1992 election, and probably ever since then. But with all due respect, the Al Gore revealed in the pages of Earth in the Balance is a far more sinister enemy of humankind than those nasty one-liners convey. Start with the question of population. Al Gore is as fanatically committed as Prince Philip to the reduction in world population, what the British royal consort refers to as culling the human herd. In the very first chapter of Earth in the Balance, Al Gore presents the same population curve that you saw earlier today, and which Lyndon LaRouche has used for years as a pedagogical device demonstrating the powerful role of the nation-state system as the efficient instrument for man once and for all being able to truly realize his creative potential as a creature in the living image of God. But Gore's message is exactly the opposite. For Gore, the fact that the emergence of the nation-state system and the consequent spread of scientific and technological progress has made it possible for billions of people to live and prosper is a problem, a grave problem, a threat to the ecosystem. Gore wrote, quote, "No goal is more crucial to healing the global environment than stabilizing human population. The rapid explosion in the number of people since the beginning of the scientific revolution, and especially during the latter half of this century, is the clearest single example of the dramatic change in the overall relationship between the human species and the Earth's ecology system. Moreover, the speed with which this change has occurred has itself been a major cause of ecological disruption as societies that learned over the course of hundreds of generations to eke out a living within fragile ecosystems are suddenly confronted in a single generation with the necessity of feeding, clothing, and sheltering 2 or 3 times as many individuals within those same ecosystems." Now remember that in 1972, the self-confessed British agent Henry Kissinger prepared National Security Memorandum 200, defining population growth in the developing world as a national security threat to the United States. In Earth in the Balance, Al Gore fully endorses Kissinger's call for third world genocide. These are quotes again. "Consider the plight of several countries as estimated by the best case scenarios projected by the United Nations Fund for Population Activities. Kenya," Gore wrote, "which now has 27 million people, will have within 30 years an estimated 50 million people. Egypt's population, 55 million people today, is increasing by an amount equal to the entire population of Israel every 4 years. Nigeria, which already has 100 million people, will have within 30 years at least 300 million people. All 3 countries are already putting great strains on their natural resources and threatening the integrity of their ecology systems. So it is truly frightening to imagine the impact of doubling or tripling their numbers, not to mention the pitiful quality of life these extra scores of millions can expect. Already, new epidemics, from cholera to the Black Plague to AIDS, have emerged in societies knocked off balance by rapid population growth and the consequent disruption of their traditional patterns of living and the degradation of their surrounding environment. Never mind the policies of the International Monetary Fund, the consequences for Africa of a century of British and other imperial looting and plundering, which has moved into a more virulent postmodernist phase in the past several years. Never mind Prince Philip's SAS mercenary armies, disguised as game wardens, stalking human prey. Al Gore's racist assumption is that Africans must live within the centuries-old boundaries of their ecosystem, deprived of modern infrastructure and modern technology that could transform the African continent into an oasis of prosperity, a breadbasket for the world, if the imperial looters were driven out. And most of all, Africa is not to develop into a continent of modern nation-states based on the principles of the American system. Population growth in Al Gore's fractured universe causes AIDS. Gore's anti-technology bias is not, however, merely reserved for the developing world. We have fallen victim, Gore writes elsewhere in the book, to a kind of technological hubris which tempts us to believe that our new powers may be unlimited. We dare to imagine that we find technological solutions for every technologically induced problem. It is as if civilization stands in awe of its own technological prowess. Technological hubris tempts us to lose sight of our place in the natural order and believe that we can achieve whatever we want to. Gore's hatred of the nation-state system is further advanced in the pages of Earth in the Balance as he heaps praise on what he calls, quote, post-national entities like Kurdistan and Kashmir. In fact, Gore adds quite happily, quote, some people now define themselves in terms of an ecological criterion rather than a political subdivision. So he apparently equates nation-states with housing complexes. For example, he continues, Amazonia is used by peoples of several nationalities in the world's largest rainforest, where national boundaries are often invisible and irrelevant. But perhaps nowhere does Al Gore declare himself the enemy of the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition of man in the living image of God in more clear-cut terms than in his chapter-length tirade against Plato, which he entitled Environmentalism of the Spirit. Gore chose to illustrate the chapter with the detail of Raphael's 1510 painting, The School of Athens, and by now you probably won't be surprised to find out that Al Gore's interpretation will differ dramatically from the way Lynn's discussed this and the way that Will discussed it this afternoon. The detail shows Plato on the left as you're looking at the painting, pointing to the heavens, while Aristotle is pointing to the earth. In Al Gore's fractured world, Plato represents the tradition of man divorced from nature, bearing no moral responsibility for the ecosystem. Plato, he claims, severed scientific truth from morality and was therefore the father of all forms of totalitarianism, from the Roman Empire right up to Hitler and Stalin. Quote, one of the most influential thinkers in the early church, St. Augustine, Gore wrote, recounts how attracted he was early in the 5th century to Plato's view of the physical world and how he struggled to overcome his love of Platonic theory before he could rationalize his acceptance of Christ's true message. Later in the same chapter, quote, by assuming that the human intellect is not anchored in a context of meaningful relationships with both the physical world and the Creator, Plato assured that later explanations of the workings of the world would become progressively more abstract. He next saddles Plato with responsibility for Francis Bacon. Gore continues, Francis Bacon is a case in point. His moral confusion, the confusion at the heart of much of modern science, came from his assumption, echoing Plato, that human intellect could safely analyze and understand the natural world without reference to any moral principles defining our relationship and duties to both God and God's creation. This leads Gore to condemn Plato for Hitler and Stalin. Quote, since the onset of the scientific and technological revolution, it has seemingly become all too easy for ultra-rational minds to create an elaborate edifice of clockwork efficiency capable of nightmarish cruelty on an industrial scale. The atrocities of Hitler and Stalin and the mechanical sins of all who helped them might have been inconceivable except for the separation of facts from values and knowledge from morality. At the root of this belief lies a heretical misunderstanding of humankind's place in the world as old as Plato. Aristotle, on the other hand, was for Al Gore the antidote to Plato's evil Gnosticism. Quote, the heritage of Aristotle's thought, Gore explains to us, was kept alive principally in the Arabic-speaking world. Alexander, who was tutored by Aristotle, established his thought throughout the land he conquered, and the city he chose as his capital, Alexandria, became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. But for many centuries, the West was isolated from this intellectual tradition. Only after the returning Crusaders brought new ideas back to Europe did the West rediscover the other half of its Greek heritage. As the 13th century began, Europeans, impressed with the intellectual achievements of Arab civilization, discovered and translated several works of Aristotle, Ethics, Politics, Logic, among others, which had disappeared from Western thought but had been preserved in Arabic. According to Al Gore, it was this Aristotelian revival that eventually created the Renaissance, which he described as, quote, the impulse to reconnect with the earth. Now, no one can accuse Al Gore of having an original thought. I would hesitate to stand up here and even claim that he ever read a word of Plato or Aristotle, or that he could have understood it if he did. He freely credits Michael Novak, the theologian of the free market, in both the text and in the acknowledgments of Earth in the Balance, as one vital influence on his grasp of theology. He pays homage to Teilhard de Chardin, but especially to James Lovelock, the modern-day reviver of the Gaia hypothesis, which is a modern form of Earth Mother worship, for shaping his personal theology. Indeed, Al Gore likes to talk about the fact that when he came back from a tour of duty in Vietnam in the early 1970s, where he served as a reporter, that he had enrolled in the Vanderbilt University Divinity School to really become clear about where he would go with his life. Well, in fact, his main professor at the Divinity School at Vanderbilt, a man named Eugene Tissell, was one of the leading proponents of the Club of Rome. And the main text that he read when he was a theology student at Vanderbilt was Limits to Growth. So that theological track made an indelible impression on Al Gore as well. The issue is not originality. The issue is that in words and in deeds, Al Gore is a conscious philosophical enemy of everything that the American Revolution, our federal Constitution, and the American system represents in the world today. And it seems to me that that, first and foremost, is the first impeachable offense to be noted against Al Gore. At a moment when the future of humanity hangs in the balance, destroying Al Gore is one of the most efficient means at our disposal to drive the Prince Philips, the George Soroses, the Henry Kissingers back into their cages while humanity moves forward. Thank you.
Earth in the Balance is a 7-year-old book. Gore's presidential run took place about 11 years ago. Has he changed, or is he still the same as he was then?
Well, he's not only not changed, but the experience of the years has made him even more of a genocidal maniac and more of a danger to this country and every nation on this planet. Not only does he still adhere to every one of those insane, murderous policies, but we have the unfortunate experience of the past 12 months in particular, really the past 6.5 years, of seeing Al Gore in action. Throughout the first phase of the Clinton presidency, his involvement was relatively circumscribed to a few key areas of policy. For example, he was given wide latitude to develop his own stamp on U.S.-Russian relations. And what we know is that Al Gore was a major contributing factor to the devastation that has fallen upon Russia in that period. He aligned himself with the most corrupt, murderous, mafiosi elements in Russian political life, particularly Viktor Chernomyrdin, who was the single most corrupt political figure in Russia over the last decade. We know that in August of 1998, following the Russian monetary and financial crisis, which nearly brought the entire global system down, that Gore intervened to get Chernomyrdin reinstalled as prime minister in order to ensure that Gore's backers on Wall Street and in London would have their speculative pound of flesh from Russia paid in full. Now, in the past 12 months, 14 months, we've seen Al Gore acting on a much broader theater of international activity. Number one, since the outbreak of the Monica Lewinsky affair, Al Gore has been the de facto president of the United States. Dick Morris, unfortunately, had it right in his article in The Hill last week when he said Al Gore's running policy at the White House, because President Clinton was devastated by the whole assault on the presidency, particularly the Lewinsky phase, and deferred all major policy decisions while he was under the gun of impeachment to Al Gore and to other like-minded enemies of President Clinton's policy outlook within the administration. And what's the consequences of that? Well, the Deputy Secretary of State, Strobe Talbot, a few weeks ago went to Moscow. He's been President Clinton's personal emissary to Russia. And he came back with devastating news that in the past 12-month period, with Gore running roughshod, U.S.-Russian relations have gone down the tubes, and it's worse than at any point since President Clinton came into office. In part, this is due to the fact that Al Gore has pursued a policy of provocative attacks against many of the countries around the world that are the leading political allies of Bill Clinton, and allies that Bill Clinton has recognized as allies. The Middle East situation. President Clinton did not support war against Saddam Hussein. And in November of 1998, Clinton stayed home from a highly important, high-visibility Asia trip to make sure that the bombings were called off against Iraq. A month later, Gore personally prevailed when Clinton was even further under the impeachment gun. In fact, it was the week of the vote in the House on his impeachment, and won President Clinton over to allowing the bombings of Iraq. That devastated U.S. relations with Russia. It devastated U.S. relations with China. We know from Gore's 1988 campaign that he was fanatically opposed to the Middle East peace process. And now, as the result of a year of Gore, not Clinton, on top of things, we have the Middle East on the verge of a regional war, not just the collapse of the Y plantation agreements, but we are away perhaps moments, perhaps days from a full-scale shooting war that could bring in Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt. The entire region could be blown up, all as the result of this. And now we've got the specter of Al Gore sort of flashing his teeth last week at a conference at the State Department from the 24th through the 26th of February on fighting corruption, which is the buzzword for the globalists for taking out any governments that oppose their one-world schemes, their looting and genocidal schemes. Bill Jones, our White House correspondent, attended that conference, and we've got a brief live report from the State Department at the conclusion of those events. So let's go to that.
Good.
Vice President Al Gore today concluded a three-day conference which he had called to discuss the issue of corruption. The issue, however, did not involve the vice president's fundraisers at the Buddhist temples, nor did it involve his dirty deals with Viktor Chernomyrdin, the Russian mogul who used to be prime minister and is considered the richest man in Russia because of the money that he has won from all his corrupt deals. No, the deals of the vice president were not dealt with at all at this corruption conference. Rather, it was a three-day shindig in which Al invited a total of about 70 countries to discuss how he, the vice president, was going to fight corruption worldwide. It's surprising that so many countries showed up for this little event, but again, many countries were concerned that if they didn't come to a conference called by the vice president and dealing with the issue of corruption, they themselves would be considered by the United States as somewhat tainted. So they came in great numbers, and they discussed their own particular problems in their own particular countries. The subject for the vice president, however, was not corruption. The subject was rather how to overthrow legitimate governments who try to buck the wave of the new globalism. The vice president himself in November replaced President Clinton at a noted conference conducted by the Asian Pacific Economic Conference in Kuala Lumpur. The vice president replaced the president, who then was tied up in this debacle in Iraq, trying to coordinate the raids against Saddam Hussein. At the conference in Kuala Lumpur, the vice president declared war on the host of that conference, the Malaysian government of Prime Minister Mahathir bin Mohamad. He tried in his speech to foment revolt on the streets against the Malaysian Prime Minister, talking about, in Malaysian, reformasi and korupsi. He didn't succeed in fomenting this revolt at that time, although he shocked most of the delegates to that conference, representing most of the Asia-Pacific nations, who thought that the vice president himself must be something like a maniac. However, his campaign was quite serious. And at his corruption conference in these last few days, he sent a very clear warning to any country, such as the Malaysian government of Prime Minister Mahathir, which tries to take measures to fend off the global financial crisis by imposing exchange controls or similar moves to protect their nation's population. In the age of globalism, the vice president was making clear these measures will not be tolerated. The issue of corruption, the vice president indicated, can easily be utilized against any nation of the world that has come to loggerheads with the global constituency. In this situation, groups like the Transparency International and other so-called non-governmental organizations will be mobilized in order to foment revolt, to make sure that the countries of the third world toe the line in regard to the international financial crisis. No national solutions will be permitted, the vice president made very, very clear. In this brave new world that has been indicated by the vice president, the international institutions, the NGOs, roughly affiliated to organizations close to Britain's Prince Philip and to the organizations of the British Commonwealth, will be mobilized to measure and to investigate all issues of corruption in any country of the world. If a decision is made that a country is corrupt, in accordance with the categories laid down by these NGOs, that a campaign will be conducted in the press in order to force that government either to resign or to reform. In this way, the global financial institutions have a fifth column within the nations of the world to prevent any resistance to the policies that they may dictate. People may think now that we have already left 1984 behind us, but this three-day conference indicates that we may be facing 1984 and the rigors of Al Gore's new age and his brave new world ahead of us. For EIR, this is Bill Jones at the State Department.
So that's the Al Gore story. Now, I know that most of our listeners actually agree with what we've been saying. There's no way you could have known all the details. There's no way you could have known all the history. But you've seen Al Gore. The great majority of you firmly believe, inside your hearts, and you'll say it man to man personally in private situations, this is an evil man who must not be allowed near any kind of power. Don't talk about President of the United States. I mean, this man is not qualified to be a police officer on the beat. He has too many problems. Deep moral problems. This all of you know. The question is, just what are you going to do about it in the few remaining weeks or perhaps months which you have? Gore's nomination for the Democratic candidacy would essentially ensure a disaster in the election of Texas Governor George W. Bush. Gore's present position as de facto acting president is creating foreign policy disasters for the United States every day as the world economy collapses and the U.S. economy prepares to follow it down the drain. Now, in a period when we need a great American president on the order of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, or in our own century, the Franklin Roosevelt, whom Jeff has been mentioning, in a period when we need a great president, are you going to permit Wall Street money and television to give us a venal figure of the order of a shrub Bush or the unelectable Gore, who will not be president? Or are you going to come out openly? That is what has been missing so far. Americans, frankly speaking, are disgusted by Al Gore, even though most of them don't know all the reasons which we've shown on this show. They find him disgusting. But what will they do? Will they act? Will they come out publicly? The next weeks must see discussions in town meetings, in factories, in offices, within families, in neighborhoods. You've been listening to a special edition of EIR Talks on the Al Gore Danger. We'll be back with further on this subject in coming weeks.
200 or so people. Now, appropriately, Senator Gore's 1988 national campaign headquarters was located at the Opryland Hotel, the mecca of the country western music world. Gore's campaign strategy was to score a big win on Super Tuesday, the mega primary day that grouped together most of the states of the Deep South. Gore dubbed his campaign strategy the Confederate strategy. It failed. Although Gore took some of the southern states, he was badly beaten by a little-known New England liberal, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, in Florida and Texas. And African-American voters throughout the South cast their votes overwhelmingly for Reverend Jesse Jackson. If Al Gore's performance was poor in the heart of the Confederacy, his record north of the Mason-Dixon line was absolutely abysmal. In the make-it-or-break-it primary election in New York, Gore was shunned by Governor Mario Cuomo, and he won a kiss-of-death endorsement from New York City Mayor Ed Koch. On primary day, Dukakis won 51% of the Democratic votes. Jesse Jackson won 37% of the Democratic votes, and Al Gore came in with barely 10%. Thus ended Al Gore's 1988 quest for the presidency. By the tail end of the New York primary campaign, Gore was in such a state of bipolar rage over his dismal performance that he resorted to desperate, outright racist cheap shot attacks against his opponents. You can take the boy out of the Confederacy, but you can't so easily take the Confederacy out of the boy. First, his one big New York political booster, Ed Koch, badly damaged Gore's chances by declaring that Jews would have to be, quote, crazy to vote for Jesse Jackson. A disastrous blunder that Gore promptly compounded by publicly endorsing Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir's vehement rejection of Ronald Reagan's call for a land for peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. So Gore was on record as early as 1988 as being absolutely opposed to the policies towards the Middle East peace process being pursued by President Clinton. Gore's campaign publicist in New York, not coincidentally, David Garth, had been Shamir's campaign manager and was also the longtime political advisor to Ariel Sharon, the butcher of the Palestinian refugee camps at Sabra and Shatila. And the head of Gore's New York campaign organization was Brooklyn Assemblyman Noah Deer, who was a founder of Rabbi Meir Kahani's Jewish Defense League terrorist gang, who never abandoned that racist cause. Gore next one-upped Koch in the closing moments of the New York campaign by launching into a tirade against Dukakis for letting killers free on weekend furloughs from Massachusetts state prisons so they could rape and murder. Yes, it was Al Gore, not George Bush, who launched the infamous Willie Horton campaign. A Bush campaign staffer, Floyd Brown, watching the Gore-Dukakis-Jackson debate on television, merely followed up the lead provided by...
Welcome to a special edition of EIR Talks on the Al Gore Danger. It's Wednesday, March 3rd, 1999. My name is Tony Papert, and with us in the studio is EIR Counterintelligence Director Jeff Steinberg. We're going to be drawing heavily on a presentation that Jeff gave on this subject, the Al Gore Danger, February 13th of this year at a Washington area conference. Now, Al Gore has grown in prominence from day to day to day, especially over the current weeks and months. He's virtually acting president. He's out front. He appears to be making all these significant policy decisions. And many people have the illusion, the dangerous illusion, that he has locked in the Democratic presidential nomination for the year 2000. At the same time, it's widely felt, and there's evidence widely available in the public domain, that Al Gore is actually unelectable. What is the story, Jeff? Can Al Gore be elected president?
Number one, Al Gore cannot and will not be elected president. And the effort is now underway on the part of the people behind Al Gore and, ironically, the people behind the George Bush Jr. campaign for the Republican nomination to create the illusion, to create the bluff that Al Gore is the only person who could conceivably get the Democratic Party nomination for the year 2000. This is aimed at deterring any other far more potentially viable candidates from among many people in the Democratic Party from coming forward at this point. There's the blackmail that Al Gore has, quote, all of the money locked up, and similar kinds of things to create a kind of groundswell. From the standpoint of the backers of George Bush Jr., it's understandable why they want Al Gore to have the Democratic nomination, precisely because he couldn't win an election. A recent Pew Charitable Trust poll of independent and Democratic and Republican voters reveals that 45% of those people agree on one and only one thing, which is that they will vote for anybody, Democrat or Republican, over Al Gore. Now, this is not something merely in the realm of speculation, because once before, Al Gore ran for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party on his own. He was not running as the mannequin-like coattail of a qualified and very personable candidate like Bill Clinton, but was running for the Democratic nomination. That was in 1988. And at the beginning of my presentation several weeks ago, I gave a kind of an encapsulated history of Al Gore's 1988 campaign, and it just illustrates his unelectability. So let's look at the first part of that presentation.
Good.
Many of you may not remember it, but in 1988, U.S. Senator Albert Gore Jr. ran for the Democratic Party presidential nomination. Gore was as desperately, obsessively committed to being President of the United States in 1988 as he is today. You can see the look of determination in his eyes in this 1996 campaign photograph that was taken by his wife Tipper and published in a family photo album called Picture This. It's available at the Loudoun County Public Library, therefore I assume it's available in most every public library in the United States in a town with a population over Gore. The same Floyd Brown, by the way, would emerge in 1992 among the most vicious slanderers of President Bill Clinton.
What was Gore's response to this stinging rejection by the voters?
Well, you know, very often when people go through traumatic political failures, they'll step back, they'll reconsider, they'll almost sort of review their entire career or their entire life and search for something that gives them an answer to why they failed. In Gore's case, why he failed to capture the hearts and minds of the core constituents, the traditional voters of the Democratic Party. I'm reminded of Franklin Roosevelt, who was struck by polio after having launched a successful political career in New York State. And he used that long battle with his disease to go back and reread the Founding Fathers. When he recuperated from his illness, he reemerged as a very much transformed political figure. No longer the New York, Wall Street patrician speaking to the interests of the British-American crowd, but a figure who was committed to reviving the best traditions of our republic. In Gore's case, he went the other direction. Gore simply made it more and more clear in everything that he did following that hideous defeat in 1988 that he was going to be, like Adolf Hitler before him, the candidate for the financial oligarchy, who would do the murderous things that would be required of a person literally holding dictatorial power over the United States government during the period of the most immense financial and monetary crisis that civilization has faced in the modern era.